Our next section revolves around what Catholic marriage is. Now, I know a lot of you are probably thinking, I already know what marriage is all about, but if I asked you to describe it, you'd probably have a problem doing so. So we're going to go through what the definition of marriage really is in the Catholic Church. Okay, now the role of husband and wife. There's so many things I could say about marriage. We don't have time to cover it all. What I'm going to just leave you on is that you probably have picked out the readings for your wedding by this point, and a lot of people pick out wonderful verses from Ephesians. There's a lot about love in there, but Ephesians, ironically, is that book that mentions that horrible word that women cringe at in our society, and that's the word of submission. Okay, and it's because in our society we look at submission as being dominance, that women are supposed to be dominated by their spouse. That is not what the Catholic definition of submission is. In fact, man and woman in marriage are equals. They are not, any one of them is not greater than the other. So if you have that opinion getting into marriage, you've got the wrong idea of submission. Submission is simply getting below the mission of the family and allowing the husband in those situations to make those decisions. Now, what did St. Paul in Ephesians tell the men to do? He said this: husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church? He died for the sake of his bride. So the Christian view of marriage, and if you look in the Bible, the most commonly used analogy between Jesus and his church is bridegroom and bride. So Jesus married the church on Good Friday. Husbands are called to show that love to their spouse by sacrificing themselves for her. So men, I challenge you, you have the harder role here, okay? Because if you're not sacrificing your needs, your desires for her on a daily basis, you're not doing your job in marriage. So what is love? What does the Catholic Church define love as? In Humanae Vitae, it's defined this way. So you can refer to church encyclicals for that. I try to stay away from just quoting them because, if you're not Catholic, it doesn't really mean a whole lot to you. So marriage is essentially four things. And think about the cross. Think about Jesus on the cross. Every single time we talk about these things and ask yourself, did Jesus do this? Okay. First of all, it is a free gift of self, made without reservation. So Jesus did not want to go to the cross. In fact, we know from the Bible that he agonized over it in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before he was handed over, or the night he was handed over. So we know he did not want to go to the cross. Why did he? Because it was for our benefit. He chose suffering for a greater good. You won't always have to do that in marriage. There are some blissful times that you'll have, but there are other times where you have to sacrifice yourself. So if you are not willing to compromise with your spouse, you are not ready for marriage. It's a total gift of self, made without condition. So Jesus didn't say, you know what, you can scourge me, you can punish me, but you can't crucify me. That's not fair. I am without sin. So it involves total self-donation, and oftentimes you will give more than you really think you were going to have to. It's a fruitful gift of self. It's made without substitute. I don't have to explain how Jesus was fruitful. Whether you're Christian or not, you can understand that he was faithful to the end. But we could say a lot about those things when we're talking about sexuality, and I'll mention that a little bit later. What I do want to mention is that your spouse is totally irreplaceable. Now, keep in mind, marriage is till death do you part. God forbid if one of you were to die, the other one is free to get remarried, okay? Because marriage is for this life, not the next. However, could you ever really replace your spouse? No. You'll never find someone as lovely and as quirky as the person you have right now. Okay, so you can get another spouse in that sense, but you can't replace your spouse ever. It's a faithful gift. It's also a fruitful gift of self. So Jesus went to the cross because he knew that if he didn't, then we would depend on him to work miracles for us. He wanted us to be him in the world. He wanted us to be the body of Christ and to do his work and to show his love throughout the whole world. Okay, so he left us with that in mind. So God's plan is open to creating new life. So essentially what marriage is, it's a free gift, total gift, faithful gift, and fruitful gift. Whether you agree with that or not, I think we can agree with this last point, that love is meant to be unconditional. Okay, so think about it. What is unconditional love? Other than just saying it's without condition. Really what it is being intimate with somebody. In our society, we view the word intimacy as being the same thing as sex or sexuality. It's not. Being intimate, you can be intimate with a close friend of the same sex. It just means being vulnerable. It means if I have that best friend, a soulmate, I can go to him and say, you know what, I was feeling this way, or I was going to do this stupid thing, and he would call me on it saying, Tony, you're an idiot. You need to think about your life. Okay, so real intimacy is being vulnerable. So think about it. This is how you're supposed to act with your spouse. You're supposed to be totally vulnerable to them. Think about Jesus. On Good Friday, he was exalted and hailed as the Son of David. 5 days later, on Good Friday, I'm sorry, I think I said Good Friday before. On Palm Sunday, he was exalted. On Good Friday, he was crucified by the fickle crowd. Okay, so he left himself open to being exalted and crushed. So think about it, and you'll never experience real love if you don't allow yourself to do this. Let me give you an analogy. Think about that first moment at which you confessed your desire to date the person that you're getting married to right now. Probably a very nerve-wracking moment. You kind of debated it in your head, and you've decided, you know what, it's better to know for sure than to not say anything and then move on and I don't marry this person. Okay, so you muster up your strength and you say something, and you're elated to find out they feel the same way about you. Now, what if they didn't? You probably had previous relationships at which the person did not share the same idea. So, but really, if you're going to experience what real love is, you have to be vulnerable. You have to put yourself in those situations at which you're being exalted or crushed. When you get married, you could say the littlest thing and destroy your spouse's confidence that day. You know, you can cut so deep in the words you say. And that's really what marriage is all about, being vulnerable and choosing the good, not the bad. Now, what are the wedding vows? Most of you, quite honestly, I'm afraid to ask, but how many of you have heard the wedding vows from your priest? Most of you probably have not. So let's go over those vows real quick. The first vow is, have you come here freely? At which you will say yes. That takes care of the first condition that we just talked about. So are you drunk from the night before? Do you know where you're at? Are you getting married to this person for the right reasons? Is this for money? Is it for status? Is it for power? Is it because your parents told you so? Okay. Do you really want to marry this person? If you don't give your consent, you are not married. Or if you say yes and you really don't mean it, you're not really married. Okay. Do you agree to love each other totally and faithfully until death do you part? We've heard of all this stuff before on every wedding. This takes care of the second and third condition we just talked about. So do you agree to love this person no matter what? What if, I'm sure they're very attractive right now. What if they lose all that? Okay. God forbid. What if I'm in a fire and I'm totally disfigured? Will my spouse stay with me? Okay. I could mention all types of different situations, but are you really willing to be there forever? What if they get cancer next year? Are you willing to sit by their bedside as they die? If the answer is no, don't get married. Okay, and then the third vow, which we usually lie on if we're not planning on using NFP, or we're planning on using contraception, I should say. Will you accept the love and responsibility that children God may give you? And if you're anything like me, I said yes, yes, and in about 5 years. And that's really not being open to God's plan. So the unfortunate reality is most people will say yes at the altar, but they don't really mean it in that sense. And for me, I had a lack of faith in God's plan because of that. Okay. So what is the meaning of sex? If you were to have to define what is the meaning of sex, what would it be? Most people have no idea. The meaning of sex really is a renewal of the vows. It's beautiful when couples want to renew their vows after like 20 years of marriage, but it's really not necessary, because every time you have sex, you should be saying, I love you freely and only you. I love you totally. I love you faithfully, and I love you fruitfully. And if we don't say all four of those things at the same moment, we're not really being authentic to our vows. Give you an example. What if, God forbid, I'm thinking of someone else during sex with my wife? I might not physically commit an affair, but if I'm mentally doing it, then it's just as bad as if I was physically doing it. So I'm not being faithful to my vows. If we're only having sex because, one of us is going to pout the next day if we don't get it, then that's not giving ourselves freely. If we're not fully present in the act, we're not giving ourselves totally. And again, if we're using contraception, we're not giving ourselves fruitfully. So these are all violations of love. Now, what is sex? It's two things. It's unitive, meaning pleasure, enjoyment, all the good stuff that we hear about. In procreation, yes, this act has a meaning other than just pleasure. Okay, so every act of intercourse should say all four of those vows. If we don't, then we're just using their body to get our kicks. So again, if I'm thinking of someone else while having sex with my wife, I'm really just using her body to get some sort of gratification, but I'm really not sharing love with her at that moment. I'm just using her. So contraception, though, implies from the very beginning a conditional sex act. So in this situation, we are not giving ourselves in a procreative sense. We're basically saying this is just about pleasure. So instead of being vulnerable with our spouse, we're trying to protect our spouse from the person we love the most. Okay, think about it this way. If you only held your spouse's hands when you're wearing rubber gloves, I mean, that's kind of weird, but that's quite literally what we're doing when we're having sex using contraception. Okay, so it wouldn't be loving for me to say, you know what, honey, you look beautiful, but I can't stand your hair today. Please put a bag over your head so I don't have to look at you. Okay, that is a violation of who she is because I'm denying that fertility. Okay, so if I'm offended by my wife's ovaries or she's offended by my testes, she's not respecting, or I'm not respecting the way God made us as male and female. So how can we contradict this marital love? There's a lot of different ways we can, but things like masturbation, pornography, strip clubs, all these things say sex is just about pleasure, has nothing to do with any responsibility whatsoever. This is not the way God created us to be. If you have any habitual problems with these things, I urge you to get it figured out now because it will only become worse when you get married. I know for a fact, I'm not going to tell you my story, but I have experience with some of these things, and it left me totally empty. And it took me 22 years to get my life in order. Okay. My spouse knew about this stuff after a while. Really, I have to ask myself, what is a spouse for? My wife is not just a function or a vessel for me to have sex with. When my wife saw myself going to some of these things, she's asking, you know, what's wrong with me? Why am I not enough woman for my spouse? Why does he have to do these things behind my back? Okay. And really, the answer to that question is it has nothing to do with her. Lust can never be satisfied. So lust is not okay even in marriage. You have to love your spouse with your whole heart. And quite honestly, in situations like that, when spouses are okay with these things, when you have sex with your spouse and they're into masturbation or pornography, you really have to ask yourself, is this something that, are they having sex with me? Or are they just getting their kicks, you know, and expecting this as a chore and a marital right that they ought to have because we're married? So going back to the whole idea of, you know, sex, what is the meaning of sex? Everything that God wanted us to do to survive as a culture has two meanings. One of them is always pleasure, and one of them is responsibility. Pope John Paul II wrote a book called Love and Responsibility, where he outlined all this. But just keep in mind, think about the 7 deadly sins. Each of them explains something God really wants us to do, but we've perverted it and made it selfish about ourselves. Okay? So think about food. Every, you know, health nut, you don't even have to be a health nut. We all know that the meaning of food is not just pleasure. It's also to give you some sort of nutrition, right? So junk food, what is junk food? I love Oreos. They're so good, but they have no nutritional value. There's not one redeeming quality from an Oreo cookie, okay? It's just there to satisfy us. So the meaning of food is clearly not just enjoyment, but also nutrition. Okay, but when we believe that we can go on the Bluebell, Dr. Pepper, Oreo, Hershey's diet, we're saying, and if I went on just those 4 foods for a year, I'd probably develop cancer very quickly. We all know that's not good for my body. Okay, because just like food, sex should have some sort of other meaning other than just pleasure, or it just becomes another indulgence in our life. So eventually, Marianne and I got off the pill. We ran into a good Catholic friend who told us not to be on contraception. So we got off the pill. But did we go all natural? Not really. We used withdrawal. I'm not going to explain what that is, but I think you can figure it out. So we had the idea that the Catholic Church was against artificial contraception. That's not true. If the Church was against artificial things, then there would not be a single Catholic hospital in the world. And we would not believe in medicine at all. We'd believe it's God's will if you die. Okay, that's not what we believe. The Catholic Church believes that it's wrong to take medication, quote unquote, that turns our body into something it was never intended to be. In other words, in the sense of contraception, it's taking a functioning organ and making it not function. All medicine is geared for making our body whole, not destroying it. Okay, so we practiced withdrawal for a while and eventually became pregnant after 3 years of marriage. We gave birth to 2 babies back to back, and then we had a miscarriage. So that's Garen, Sebastian, and Parker is our miscarriage. We've lovingly named it Parker. Now, we did not decide to have a 3rd child until Cornelius in 2014. Notice the gap in age between our 2nd son, then using NFP, and deciding to have our 3rd son. And right now it's 2017 and we still only have 3 children. So NFP flat out works. This is not something that is just a theory or not as effective as contraception. We're going to continue with the next section.